So Amadea and I are out and about. It is nighttime on Penghu Island. On what island are we are? It starts with an M.
Oh, yeah, it does start with an M.
On an island that starts with an M in the Penghu Islands of Taiwan. So we took a ferry across the Taiwan Strait to get here. Now we're walking around. It looks pretty cool. You can't really see anything because it's really dark. But we're going to talk about evidence in public forum debate, because that's what cool people do in a night out in Penghu Islands.
Bro, I was sure it started with... Oh no, it's the largest city is Magong on the largest island. Wait, which is also named Magong.
Okay, it is. Yeah. So, double correct.
Let's go.
So anyway, I want to preface this by saying neither of us actually think that non-resolutional theory is like legitimate theoretically or like is good for the activity to exist. Mostly we just don't really think it makes sense though. But
Max still wanted to include this clip, which I'm very much against.
I still want to include this clip. If there's a theory that I think could be effective, it's these ones. I think there's like a list of different rules that cut cards should follow. And this is regardless of if they are read in case or if they are sent after being paraphrased, whatever. I think there's a list of rules they absolutely have to follow. Rule 1, I think you cannot splice together different subjects, verbs, and objects. Like, I think if there's an independent clause that has a subject, verb, and object, you have to retain, like, the grammatical integrity of that clause. I think that this is, like, there is no way that you can, like, pick a subject from one sentence and a verb from a different sentence, and, like, not somehow change the intent and the precision of the author's original words.
Yeah, I can fully get behind that. The sad thing is that I think that will change how over 90% of people's evidence is formatted.
Yeah, this is the thing. All of these rules, to be clear, they are currently violated by basically 100%. Actually 100% of PFers.
No, even in policy, though, I think a lot of teams are violating that. Maybe there's some teams that highlight more, but they're few and far between. And I feel like the more years pass, the less highlighting I see. Because it's just more of a trend.
I actually don't. I see zero justification for this. Genuinely.
Because I do think that one of the points of having cut cards to begin with is to be able to retain the author's wording.
Right.
That's why you don't paraphrase, because you want to be accurate to what the author's intent was. But then all of that goes away if you're just highlighting random word salad.
It's so silly. So, number 1, subject, verb, object has to stay intact. Number 2, what was number 2? I don't think you should be able to cut things between sentences. I guess that's the same as subject, verb, object needs to stay intact. We've arrived at the 7-Eleven. Let's go. Wait, what is number 2? Number 2 is I don't think that you should always keep modifiers, like modifiers of degree. So for instance, the word could, the word should, the word might, in predictions. I think these things are incredibly important to keep. And people might be like, this is so stupid. No one highlights the word could. I genuinely think this is like a terrible, terrible thing. I think that there is a massive difference between something being certain and an author saying that it is certain and an author saying it will happen and an author saying it could happen.
Yeah.
And, other words as well. And this is a difference in how much probability is in that statement. Right. And probability matters just as much as magnitude. So imagine if someone changed the magnitude of an impact in their card and they just added an extra 0. They were just it's a million instead of 100,000.
Or even imagine if the text said this has a 20% chance of causing war, and then they took away the 20%.
This has war.
Or even if they said
war.
This has a chance of causing war. I feel like a chance in debate probably sounds like it's more than 20%.
Yeah, that's true.
But then you're omitting the important part, which is that the probability is relatively low.
And you might be thinking, but this is only in the case where they give a number for the probability. No, it's not, right? The whole point is that it changes the relative probability of the statement in a very important way.
So it's like, if you wouldn't do it when there's a number, you also shouldn't do it when there's not a number.
Right. And like, gut check this. Number one, I think professors in like school would hate you doing this. Like literally. Also, like, this is just like, for example, if I told you, Amadea, I could stay up until 1 a.m. tonight, and then you went and told someone else, Max said he will stay up until 1 a.m. tonight, I would be like, I didn't say that.
Yeah.
That's not what I said. I said there's a chance that I could. I said I could. I'm able to. I didn't say that I will. And, like, that's a silly example, but, like, there are so many easy examples you can think of your daily life where, like, that really affects things. And I think in a competitive environment, that's one of them. Like, this is, if there's ever an environment where, like, the specifics of the word and the precision of the word matters, it's this one. And you're, like, people are freaking out about how paraphrasing is so terrible because we need to, you know, maintain the precision of the words, and then they just take out some of the most important words.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you doing? So that's, I think, important to me. And the other thing is, like, I think this hurts debate because it makes us all think in these absolute binaries because we are only saying those things. That's terrible.
I thought this one was a little less important when you first said it, just because I think I was thinking more from a policy mindset where, in general, you're given, or at least with good judges, you're giving credit for the argument that you present. It's not 100% until proven otherwise, which I think is a mindset that a lot of PF judges go in.
Yeah.
And so even if you don't see the word could in an argument, you would assume that it's not 100% chance. You would assume that it's based on the words in the card. So I don't think the word could is as important, but I see how it's more important when you're already in an activity where people are assuming that it's definite. So you want to push back against that.
Yeah. I think those are two. I have more, but we'll come back.
We'll come back, yes.
Those are important.
Hello guys, we're back from our pit stop at 7-Eleven and we're going to keep going down the list. I have one to add to the list, which is that, I mean, this is sort of similar to the first one, but also a little different because in addition to not cropping out like subject or object or important parts that make the sentences, their cards should also make grammatical sense, which means you shouldn't just take out random verbs. Like, the number of sentence fragments I've seen in cards is crazy, where it's just like there's no verb in the sentence at all. And then another one is even articles are important because if it doesn't make grammatical sense, then it's like you can't expect somebody to understand it just after having heard you read it in a round, because the point of debate is to be an oral communication activity. So if nobody understands you, then what even is the point anymore?
Yeah, 100% agree. It's like, it gets kind of ridiculous. Like, you hear, like, we were reading some of these examples earlier, and they're just like words strung together without any... And
like, you read it and it just doesn't make sense. It's
right.
Like, what are you saying? And the only way it would make sense is if you're reading the document, but you don't want to only be reading the speech doc. Like, that's not the point of debate.
And isn't that effectively clipping at that point? Like, in order for your argument to be understood, it requires that they read the stuff around it that you didn't say. Like, you should only get access to the stuff you did say. And if the stuff you did say is grammatically incoherent, then it's not an argument.
Yeah. Okay, so that's number 3.
Okay, we found a better way to word one of the earlier ones that actually encompasses more rules. So before I said you can't leave words like could or might unhighlighted. I still stand by that. But now we're broadening it to say if there is a qualifier on the statement to make the statement specific, right? Like, X is true under these circumstances, or in a time of war, X is true, or X is true for some people, then you can't only highlight X is true, because that turns a specific statement, a qualified statement, into a general, unqualified statement that the author never intended. And I think as a general rule, this is an intuition for why this one is true, but also a rule for all evidence. If you said that statement and you quoted the author, and you said that to the author, if they would say, no, that's not what I said, then you are misconstruing them. And I think in any of these circumstances where you're turning a specific qualified statement into a general unqualified one, they would say, no, that's not what I meant, right? That's not what I said.
Yeah.
For example, if I said, on rainy days, you should always bring an umbrella outside, and you highlighted, you said, oh, Max said you should always bring an umbrella outside, I would say that is clearly not what I said, and that is a misconstruction of my original words.
Yeah. Agree.
So if there's a qualifier, you got to put it in. That includes, like, the following sentence says but. Like, but this only holds for, or something. This is only true for.
Yeah, although we tried to draw a line, because then one question I had was like, what about different paragraphs where it's like, this could be true, and then it gives you an entire paragraph, and then afterwards like, but the opposite could be true, and then you have another paragraph ranting about the opposite. We figured that you probably don't have to include full paragraphs, which is kind of an arbitrary line to draw, but at the same time, forcing someone to highlight an entire paragraph that says it's not true seems like it's going too far. And if the author dedicated, like, more importantly though, if the author dedicated a whole paragraph to explaining why it could be true, then that seems like it could be relevant to highlight.
Yeah. I feel like,
yeah.
Like, you can't put every author's words in the context of everything else they've ever said.
Right, that too.
Like, I feel like that's one of those cases where it would be reasonable to quote them on that. If there's, like, multiple paragraphs later, a different thing that puts it in different context. Like, that's still fine, I think.
Yeah.
They wouldn't really have very good grounds to reject the quote.
True, because even if they changed their mind, like, 10 years after they wrote the original piece and came out with a piece that said the opposite thing, it's like, yeah, that's fair grounds if your opponent wants to cite it, but it's not something that you have to include just because
that would be crazy.
You're not held to every single thing that your author has said.
Yeah, so then now we have 3 rules in total. We have preserve sentence verb object structure of the original clause, meaning you can't splice together different subjects, verbs, and objects from different clauses. 2, keep it grammatically sound so that it makes grammatical sense when strung together. And 3, include all qualifiers, including words like might, could, and the circumstances in which the author is making the claim.
Perfect. Yes.
We were talking about how evidence is bad. We talked about rules, how evidence can be better. We have different theories for how, in practice, this might look to make evidence better.
Yes.
I think it is a viable option to paraphrase.
I don't think it's a viable option. I think actually, first, you say your argument in favor of paraphrasing.
Yeah,
because
sure.
it makes more sense.
Also, like, a disclaimer before this, neither of us agree with paraphrase theory. We kind of already said this, that, like, we don't like non-resolutional theory. I specifically really hate paraphrase theory.
Yeah. I hate all non-resolutional theories so
much.
But
I specifically hate, like, I've got real beef with paraphrase theory.
Well, why that theory specifically?
Like, I think there's 2 reasons. One is a logical reason, which is, like, I really think of a lot of the common theory, it makes the least logical sense. And, like, very intuitively, I think that it represents...
Wait, why does it make less logical sense than other theory arguments?
Like, I think disclosure has a bit more ground to stand on, and that's the other common PF theory argument.
Wait, is this just because you like paraphrasing?
I just think that there's more... Like, I think there's less of a reason to, like, force people to read cut cards. And I think that there's much more validity of paraphrasing than people give it credit for. And, like, listen, I'm willing to accept that paraphrasing might make misrepresentation more likely. Marginally. I think that is maybe true. I'm not fully willing to accept that. I think there's arguments for why that's the opposite. But I think it might be true.
Yeah.
My thing is, like, even if that is true, I really think it's a damn shame that people are losing grounds for paraphrasing and being forced to do it. Because I think that paraphrasing has so many other benefits that to me are really intuitive.
Yes, so you think paraphrasing good?
Well, not even necessarily. I just think it's not bad enough to justify a theory violation. Yeah. Like, it's not bad enough to justify losing the round for it.
Yeah, I mean, before we start this argument, to be fair, I do think paraphrasing is good in certain circumstances. Like, I think it's good in all lay debates. I'm like 100% pro paraphrasing in PF lay debates, or even LD lay debates, because I think that's just how people would talk to a normal person in real life. So it makes sense that that would also be the case in a debate. It's like if you're trying to persuade a parent, you're not going to introduce these cut cards that they don't even understand. Like not going to speak a language that they don't. So that's totally fine for me. And I'm also pro paraphrasing in novice debates as well. I think it's important for people to learn how to explain their arguments and kind of start at like a very basic baseline before they make more complicated arguments that require cards and explaining those cards. But I think in high level debates, I don't even know if I have that much of an opinion in PF debate just because I'm not that experienced in PF, but at least in high level policy and LD debates, I'm 100% anti-paraphrasing, even though I'm also anti-paraphrasing theory. So that's my opinion.
That makes sense. So I said that there's a logical reason why I'm against paraphrase theory. There's also kind of like an emotional reason why I'm against paraphrase theory, which is that most of the time that I've heard people talk about paraphrasing, it's in like such visceral and like moralizing terms where like, I don't know why, but for some reason it feels like the community consensus at the national level is like paraphrasing is evil and like there is no way that you could ever paraphrase ethically, and like if you do paraphrase then you are like an evil person, or you're like a fool, or you're like a novice that doesn't understand debate. And it's weird. It's like there are very few other issues that people are this dogmatic on. But really, when it comes to paraphrasing, people are like, yeah, it's like equivalent to like racism. Like, if you paraphrase, then you're a terrible person, and like that's that. And like it is so obvious that you're bad because you're like an evidence ethics violator.
Yeah.
And then they turn around and they cut cards in the way that we just saw, and they don't recognize the hypocrisy. And it's like, I think it's so deeply unfortunate. People have the position in PF, people who read paraphrase theory, they seem to have the position that the most benign paraphrasing is worse than the most terrible cut cards that we just saw.
Yeah.
And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, are you looking at the wiki? Are you looking at these arguments? Like, they're incoherent. At least would you honestly, this is a crazy take. I would prefer that people make up evidence and explain it as a coherent argument rather than misconstrue evidence in cut card form.
Yeah.
Genuinely, I think I would prefer people entirely lie, but explain the full logic behind the lie.
I'm not sure if I would go that far, but I understand like a lot of your grievances. Like that makes 100% sense to me. Okay.
Anyway, I guess I should give my takes for why I think paraphrasing is okay.
Yeah.
Again, to clarify, maybe paraphrasing is bad. I just don't think it's that bad. So the reason I think paraphrasing could be a potential solution to this is because, in my mind, when you're talking about misconstruing evidence, you're not just talking about the presentation of the evidence. You're talking about comparing the presentation of the evidence to what is intended, the intended function of the evidence with regard to the context of the round and the context of the resolution. And this is important because a lot of the arguments against paraphrasing are that it creates this duplication where there's two versions of the card. There's the paraphrase version of the card and there's the real cut card, or like the real article. The thing that I think is that duplication is inherent to debate. Not only is there the obvious duplication of like the highlighted part of the card compared to the actual like full article, like that is clearly often different, but there's also the inherent duplication of what is intended by the card, right? Because the fact of the matter is, authors do not write, for the most part, 99% of the time, in the context of the resolution, much less in the context of the other authors that you're stringing together, much less in the context of the debate that's playing out. Which means that there is always a gap between how you are using the evidence and applying the evidence and what the evidence originally wrote. And I think that is an inherent feature of debate, which means there are two things that have to be compared in order to explain misconstruction of evidence. One is the presentation of the evidence, and the other is what is intended by the evidence. I think that both of these have different levels of clarity with different forms of presentation. So in cut cards, I think the level of clarity for the presentation of the evidence itself is very high, right? Like, it's very clear what the evidence is saying. And I think that's good. That's what people care about. That's why people cut cards. But I think there is a trade-off. I think the level of clarity for what is intended by the card actually does go down. I think there are strategic incentives behind this as well. Like we talked about earlier, people can create these chameleon arguments that become something different later. Like you intended the card to support a different claim later, and you just never specify that in the first place. Or like you get access to a part of the card that wasn't in the original tag or something like that. Or you just like intentionally make the tag very vague, and so you really like spin it so that it's slightly different later. And so I think that the intention of what you mean by the card is much like decreases significantly. Whereas I think that the presentation of the evidence is very clear in most cases. I don't actually think in all cases, right? Like, because you could cut a card really badly, as we've seen, which decreases the clarity of the presentation as well. In paraphrasing, you have a different trade-off. You do have a lower clarity of the presentation of the actual evidence. It's, maybe it takes more prep time, for instance, to go look at the actual evidence. I think this is a bit marginal, but it's true, right? Like, it is slightly more likely that the evidence itself is not saying the thing because it's harder to check what the evidence itself says. But it's easier to check the other half of the comparison, right? You know exactly what they mean it to say. You know exactly what they think it says. And so you need both to determine that something is being misconstrued. You need to compare what the evidence says against what it is intended to say. In cut cards, you don't really know what it's intended to say, so that means that it's easy to misconstrue it. In paraphrase, you don't really know what it actually says, which means that it's easy to misconstrue it. Either way, I think it's easy to misconstrue it. The difference is, one, I think the gap in the second part is bigger, meaning I think the gap in terms of the intention is much wider. It's like, I think that there's a very marginal difference in the clarity of the evidence, given that you send cut cards either way. But there's a huge gap in terms of how late in the round it is before you figure out what they actually meant by the argument. I maybe cross-solves this to some extent, but I don't think it does if they're just sneaky about it, which there's strategic incentives to be. But then on top of that, I think that the second part matters to me a whole lot more than the first part, as I was alluding to before. Because if I don't know what you intend the argument to be in the first place, if I don't know the story that you're telling, then I don't know how to respond to it. I don't know really, I think that there's no debate that's happening. And so to me, this is one of the root causes of all of the problems that I'm seeing in PF, or a lot of the problems that I'm seeing in PF right now, with this like simulacra of debate, where people are just latching on to buzzwords and symbols instead of the actual story of the argument, instead of the causal chain of reasoning and logic. And instead, they're just debating out the buzzwords, and they're debating these claims that abstract further and further and further from what the topic is actually talking about. And I think that one way to avoid that in my opinion would be very straightforward, is to just have people paraphrase more. Because at least when you're paraphrasing, you add that logic to the argument. You tell the story of the argument. And maybe there's a marginally higher risk that story is misconstruing the evidence, but I think that there is at least a story being told. There is logic that you can grab and respond to, and you can say that doesn't make sense, and you can say why your arguments apply to it. Whereas in the cut card debate that we're seeing right now, where it's just tag card, tag card, tag card, you don't really get that. You don't get that at all. You don't really understand what the story of their argument is until very late in the round, which means that there's not really even a debate about it to be had, and it has the double effect of making it harder to check back against misconstrued evidence, because you can't compare the evidence as presented against, or like, the evidence itself against what they intend the evidence to be, because you don't really know what they intend the evidence to be until it's too late. So I think that difference is marginal, and the more important difference to me is much bigger, which is why I'm a pretty big fan of paraphrasing.
Okay, I guess I can go. Wait here. I'm trying to record. Okay. So I think the clarity difference is pretty big in the sense that if you paraphrase evidence, you are coming up with your own interpretation of it in some way, even if it doesn't seem like it's super obvious to you, where you're like, okay, I'm just gonna try to be as true as possible to the author's intentions. I mean, first off, that's not what debaters are actually going to do. They're going to construe it in a way that benefits their side a little more. They're going to cut out or like reinterpret parts of the evidence to make it sound like it favors them more, without even being like evidence ethics violations. There's very small things you can do to make it sound like it's favorable to your side, and it's a lot harder for people to check back against that if they can't see the exact card. And I know that Mac's response to this is going to be like, yes, the card can be right there, like it can be linked, there can be a different doc with the cards on it, but it's still so much work to have to cross-reference every piece of evidence and have to read every single card that hasn't actually been read in the round. It's like it introduces a whole speech doc that isn't even a speech doc in the actual debate because nobody's reading it out loud, but it still exists there, and it makes debate into less of an oral communication activity because instead you're just like reading and like verifying everything against these cards that haven't actually been read in the debate round. But also, even if like the paraphrasing isn't inaccurate and it's like 100% what the author was intending, there's still some omissions that you can have here. There's still like not the small text that you can read to check to see if the author had some other opinions that weren't necessarily brought into the highlighted text. I feel like just having the card right there is really helpful in the clarity part. So I think that difference is a lot bigger than Mac makes it out to be. And then for the second part, I think there's another issue at hand here, which is like the problem for figuring out the intention of the argument is more so that there's no explanation in the cut cards that we've seen so far, where it's like the tagline doesn't explain where the evidence is going, the cards are just like small blips here and there that don't actually form a coherent argument. But I think this problem is also true in paraphrasing, because when you see a lot of paraphrasing, like you don't have explanations for any of it. A lot of time it's just random claims without real warrants behind them. And so you see claim after claim after claim, and you can't string it together into a coherent story. And if you can, it's not because of the paraphrasing of the actual evidence, because if the problem here is the evidence, then paraphrasing it won't necessarily help. It's the extra explanation that you can add in. And if you think that explanation is so important, then you could also add it in a cut card format where you have your own analytics, like in the tagline or after the cards, where you explain like the missing gaps between the arguments. But just paraphrasing your evidence isn't going to fix that problem if the problem is that the evidence is just like random pieces you've strung together without explanation. There's like a bigger explanation problem here that we're not dealing with. And then also on the intention issue, I don't think you should have to know the intention of every single argument beforehand either, because sometimes it's okay if there's an argument that could have multiple intentions and then you think it has one and then you respond to that one, but it turns out that there's another way that they could have interpreted the argument that's perfectly consistent with the evidence, but then they just bring it up in the next speech and they're like, actually, your argument was that. I don't think that's as bad as Max says it is. Like, obviously, if it's so bad that it doesn't even sound like the original evidence, and it's like they have no evidence for the new arguments that they're making, so the judge wouldn't evaluate them regardless. But if somebody could read the evidence and then reasonably construe whatever interpretation they're making in the next speech, then I think it's okay, and it's your burden to realize that the evidence could have multiple interpretations that come from it and prepare for all of them. And if you haven't done that, then that's kind of your problem, because it's like if a reasonable person would see that piece of evidence and assume that it could have multiple stories, then you should have the burden to do that as well and to respond to the different versions that the argument could become in later speeches. Although I know that kind of depends on the debate format too, because obviously in a format like policy, it makes a lot more sense for people to kind of adjust their version of what the argument means throughout the round, just because there's so many speeches that the first few speeches don't necessarily have to have that much evidence or that much of a complete picture, because new arguments are still okay in the 2AC or the 2NC, or even sometimes in the 1NR and the 1AR. But in PF or LD, I would understand why you would want more of a complete picture of the argument going in. But that's my take.
Okay, I have a response.
Okay.
First on that last bit, I think, yeah, in PF, you only get one chance to respond. For example, if you're a first speaking team, and at that point, if the dominant strategy is to say, that's not what we meant, and yet there's no verifiable thing that you meant in the first speech, then this breaks debate, in my opinion. This just like eliminates clash, and then the other team isn't allowed to respond to what you actually meant. Like, then everything is conceded all the time, and then we just are weighing, and like, instead of responding to arguments that are fake. I don't like that. I think that it's bad for debate in a million different ways. I think that it's also just less fun as a debate activity. But what's happening here is interesting, because I think that Amadea is right. Like, my response to some of her complaints would be, just send the cut cards in the document when you send a speech doc, which you should do, and also disclose. Like, all of these things make smaller the gap between how easy it is to check against evidence violations. But then Amadea's solution is also to include a little bit of my solution in her solution, right? So like, we're both including a bit of the others in ours. So we're going into the middle a little bit. So I have send all of the cut cards, disclose them in advance, 30 minutes before the round, whatever. This doesn't solve all the problems, because rebuttal will still come along, or the second speaking team should ideally change their arguments slightly. I know this is not a norm in public forum, but should ideally, I think it's strategic for them to change their arguments slightly in response to the first speaking team, and they shouldn't have the burden of disclosing that in advance, because maybe they're writing it as soon as the first speaking team is disclosed to them. So you inevitably get some arguments with cards that are read without being disclosed beforehand in a lot of these rounds. And so then there's still the problem of paraphrasing, taking comparatively more of your prep time or more of your brain power to compare the paraphrase version to the card itself. And this is still a problem for cut card format. It's just less of a problem, right? Or is it? I'm actually skeptical of that. I was talking earlier, but I think that, like, for me, paraphrasing something makes it easier to understand the evidence compared to reading just the highlighted parts of the evidence. For me, it actually takes a while to like read through the highlighted parts and really try to understand what they're getting at with it. And so the solution that Amadea has to that, and I think that like paraphrasing solves this because it's kind of like a Sparks Notes version of the card that is easier to understand. Amadea's solution to this is to include a little bit of my solution in hers, right? To say, well, we could also just fix cut card format by adding some analytic stuff in between to give that kind of summary and to explain how it applies to this debate and how the cards connect to each other and stuff like that. I think this is valid as well. And so we're getting closer to each other, which is a good sign because it means that we're finding a bit more middle ground. So then the question is like, what is the difference that's left over? If we both have cut cards that are sent in the doc, we both are disclosing, we both have the explanation, the summaries in a lot of the arguments, the difference, I think, is twofold. Number one, I get to read more arguments than cut cards, which also means I get to go slower. I think that's pretty important, but it's not really my main focus. Like, I think that's a benefit, but a marginal one. I think that's similar to me in scale of like the evidence ethics stuff, given how marginal both are. The second benefit, though, I think is a pretty big one, which is that with paraphrase stuff, I think that people are very careful about checking back against word salad. Amadea made a claim in the last speech that she gave. That said, like, sometimes...
So I'm running out of battery, so...
Okay. Sometimes when people paraphrase, they just make a bunch of claims that are unwarranted. I haven't really seen this. If it's the case, I think it's much more rare. So then the question is, like, why? Why do we only see word salad when we have cut cards? And why do we not really see word salad when we have paraphrasing? I think the answer is relatively straightforward. When you're paraphrasing with your own words, there's like it's very obvious when you have word salad. When you have a cut card, there's some added weird, like, normative legitimacy that comes with just, like, having a cut card that says this stuff or that says this stuff. And so people, like, actually look past it. Like, people are less likely to challenge your evidence if it is in cut card format. If you're paraphrasing, people will comb through all of that and they will, like, really make sure it says what you're saying. And this was my experience with PF when I debated when people were paraphrasing, is people would open up the links and, like, look through all of the paragraphs that were in the original cut card and, like, really make sure that the context was correct. I think had there been disclosure, people would do this even more. But because there are cut cards, and because good teams are reading these cut cards, and these cut cards get recycled over and over again, they gain a sense of normative validity. It's like, these things are legitimate because they're cut cards, which paradoxically makes people much less likely to actually check against them. And it creates this word salad, whereas there's more pressure on PFers who are paraphrasing to construct logically sensible and coherent arguments when it's their own words, and they have no excuse if the author's words were weird, so I clunkily, word saladed them together. So I don't like word salad. I think the word salad stuff is the biggest threat to debate because it just takes away all of the logic and creates gobbledygook, and I think that paraphrasing is the solution to that. I'm willing to take a marginal hit to evidence ethics for getting rid of gobbledygook.
Hello guys. We are on a ferry 2 days later and we want to continue the conversation from the other night because my camera ran out of battery. So the last thing Mac was saying was he was trying to magnify the impact of the gobbledygook argument from the cards, and my arguments were mostly about evidence misinterpretation and time. I think evidence misinterpretation is a bigger question than Mac is making it out to be, just because it's very hard to verify that the paraphrase text says what the article actually says. People don't have that time during debate rounds to go to the original article, read all of it. Even if you include the cards in the doc, you're essentially doubling the amount of work that people have to do. I think a good analogy for this is, imagine if you got a card plus a ChatGPT version of it, and then you read the ChatGPT version. Maybe it was easier to understand, but then you had to double check it against the original article, and so that gives you the work of reading ChatGPT original article and then checking to make sure it's accurate, which is a whole nother job, and people just don't have the time or the ability to do this in debate rounds, so it's much better to just have the card text right there. I also think that the gobbledygook argument that Mac references is true of paraphrasing as well. Like, yes, paraphrasing is more likely to make grammatical sense just because people tend to write in ways that make more sense than just highlighting random words in cards. But at the same time, just because it makes grammatical sense doesn't mean it's a coherent argument. People still might use debate jargon. They might cut out all of the warrants. I don't think I've seen that many paraphrase cases on the national circuit that I think are making that much of a coherent argument, even if they do have the grammar part attached to them. I think that's a small part of the overall component that makes an argument good.
Yeah, so overall, like, I think I agree with almost everything Amadea is saying. The only disagreements that we have is in degree. Like, I agree that evidence misrepresentation might be slightly more likely, but not like that you're doubling the work, because I think that duplication thing is inherent to any debate, and things like that. But overall, like, if we continue this debate, it will just be these small disagreements in degree. And I think that what colors those disagreements is mostly like our background and experiences and intuitions. And so I think for you as an audience, like as the audience, you probably will agree with one of us based on what experiences you've had. For instance, like, my personal intuition is that I find it easier to understand an argument and even to understand cards when I have the paraphrasing, and I find it easier actually to catch the misrepresentation when I fully understand what they're intending to represent it as. Whereas for me, sometimes when I read the highlighted like parts of a card, I don't really know what they mean in the highlighted portions, like what they think that the sentence says. And so sometimes it makes it harder for me to call out the misrepresented evidence, and it makes it harder for me to respond to the argument regardless of its misrepresentation, because I just don't know what the logic is intending to be. And for that's a bigger harm. Like, I think if I was debating on the circuit right now, I would be annoyed by that, and I would have to adapt. But I also think I would adapt, and then after I adapted, and if I like had Amadea's background of always having cut cards and being used to this, then I might even prefer that afterwards. So I think that this really comes down to like your reasonable intuitions that are largely colored by experience, because we both agree with each other's arguments. Like, of course, there are some advantages of paraphrasing, and there are some advantages of cut cards, and I think it's reasonable to say right now the agreement that we came to is like the best case scenario of both probably does favor cut cards, even if like my argument is that the average of cut cards right now would improve if we like switch to the same incentives for paraphrasing, and I think you agree with that as well.
Yeah.
That like if all of these PFers who are doing this magically started paraphrasing instead with the same like level, I think things would improve. But that's not going to happen, and the cost to make that happen is better used in just improving their cut card practices, especially because we actually do both agree that the best cut card practices are probably better than the best paraphrase practices. Because the difference in arguments there is like the harm of paraphrasing exists even if they don't, even if they do it perfectly, which is that like you have to take extra prep time to check that. Whereas the harm for cut cards can be minimized if they do it perfectly, because you can actually minimize the prep time they have to take by increasing the explanation and the tag and stuff like that and making it more clear what you actually intend the card to mean. And so the consensus that we've come to is that given that like it is both a higher ceiling and it is more likely there's like less cost involved in doing this, we think that the best path forward is for PFers to continue using tag card format, or at least cut cards, and to improve that practice instead, to adopt more rules that reduce misconstruction, and to make better tags that make it more clear exactly what you're intending, and to follow better norms in that way.
Yeah. And to be clear, this also just applies to national circuit PF.
Yeah.
People are already engaged in this practice of card cutting and won't go back. I think in lay PF, there are many more benefits to paraphrasing, and that's already what people are doing, so it's not related to that at all.
Yeah. So I do not encourage people to paraphrase in the national circuit. I do still encourage people to paraphrase when they have lay audiences. I think even this could be an accessibility thing. I just don't really trust that lots of these cut cards are as, of course there's a perfect ideal where they could be, but I don't trust that they are as easily understood by like a lay audience, just in terms of grammar. And so we do both agree that you should continue cutting cards and reading cut cards in front of tech judges. Just do it better.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the conclusion.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. It's been a long 2 days.